It's time now for the John Harris Podcast on the airnetwork.net. Now, here's sports journalist extraordinaire, John Harris on the Air Network.
Welcome to the John Harris Podcast. I'm John Harris, joined by Dave Herrin, the originator of the Tendex basketball rating system. I must say a very, very good friend who I've known for quite some time, the best basketball analytical guy I've ever known and who's out there and who has never gotten the credit that he deserves, but we're going to try to give him as much as we can. Dave, how you doing?
I'm doing great, John.
I'm good, man.
I'm glad to be in Florida.
I say Dave lives outside of Orlando, enjoying life with his wife Joan and the grandkids. So life is good in Florida with Dave, and we're happy that he's given us some time, some of his wisdom and knowledge. And Dave, there's been so much talk this year about the NBA MVP, and everybody's giving their opinion on it and blah, blah, blah. But the reason why I love Tendex so much is that, yeah, you do have an opinion about it, but you have the statistical information to back up and go well beyond those opinions, which to me separates what you say and what you believe from everybody else and for what everybody else does. So let's jump right into this year's NBA MVP. I'm going to turn it over to you, let you talk about how Tendex sees the MVP race and get a little bit behind the scenes of why Tendex sees it that way.
Okay, John, I'm glad to have this opportunity. Just want to mention one thing that we've talked about several times, and that is that you have opinions, I have opinions, but very, very often, in fact, almost every time, if my opinion differs from Tendex, Tendex is right. And that's one of the things that makes it such an amazing. It's the same thing with Tendex and the scouts. The scouting performance does not equal Tendex when it comes to selecting players for the draft or for choosing MVPs or whatever. A lot of it is tainted by opinion, by sentiment, by some things like wingspan. Who cares about wingspan? But sometimes they get a little bit off center. But once you get into the NBA and you get 3 or 4 years in, it gets a little clearer. This year, Westbrook has had an amazing season. It's only the second time in the league's history that somebody has had a triple-double, and the remarkable thing about it is that both times it wasn't just 15 points, 10 rebounds, and 10 assists. It was 30 points, 10 rebounds, and 10 assists. So really, when you start and talking about the league's best player this year, it's got to be Westbrook, in my opinion. And Tendex supports that opinion. Westbrook's rating was 1.000, which is a rating exceeded only in the history of the league by one player, Will Chamberlain.
Wow.
That is something. Now, there is a little difference. In those days, the Chamberlain Robertson days, they were worn out by playing exceptionally long minutes, which reduced their rating somewhat. But their total productivity was greater. However, this year, Westbrook, in my opinion, has the numbers to be the MVP.
Talk about what that rate. I mean, I don't want to get into all the details, but what does that rating mean? Just to the folks that are listening here on John Harris Podcast here on the Air Network, what does that rating mean? What is that value? There's a value given to each rating for a player. What does that value? What does that rating mean?
The bottom line is the player with a 1,000 rating is worth 1 point to his team for every minute he plays on the court. If he's got a 500 rating, he's worth 1 point to his team for every 2 minutes on the floor. So you can see why it's unusual, because when you start getting to the point where you're worth 35 points to your 35 points to your team in a game, as Westbrook did, or in the cases of Chamberlain where it was up close to 50 points and Robertson where it was 40, you can see why Tendex is an effective system, because that's just a a mind-boggling thing to think of.
Now, what some people are trying to do is this is what happens when you have these type of situations, and when you have people that really don't know what they're talking about in a lot of ways, because a lot of it's just opinion. There's been this head-to-head battle between Russell Westbrook with Oklahoma City and James Harden with Houston, and they're playing each other in this first-round playoff series. Houston's winning the series 3-1. So some people are using that to say, well, hey, James Harden's better. He plays on a better team. MVP should be all about winning, and his team wins more than Oklahoma City wins. But
according to Tendex, was the best player in the league the 2 years that Curry won it. Now everybody say, well, Golden State won, so Curry must be the best, but that's not the way it works. Sometimes you have a guy who's a great player on a lousy team. Oscar Robertson played for one of the worst franchises in the league history. When he wasn't there, they won about 33% of the time. When he was there, they won close to 60%. Well, they still didn't win league titles, but he personally was responsible for huge numbers of victories, and that's the same thing with Westbrook. Because with Harden and Durant no longer with the team, and Ibaka having faded out of sight, Westbrook is kind of like the Lone Ranger over there. So his team is definitely a losing team without him. Whereas now Harden's team is greatly improved this year. They picked up some very good players, and so now all of a sudden Harden looks like a winner. Well, that's not the way it works, because Harden was the great player on the Whig team a couple of years when he should have been called the MVP, and now it's Westbrook. It doesn't follow automatically that you have to be on the champion team in order to be the MVP. It just doesn't. Bill Russell won MVP a whole bunch of times officially. He never won it once, according to Tendex, because Will Chamberlain and Oscar Robertson were better players. But Russell played for a team that had 10 during the duration of his career, they had 10 Hall of Fame players, and 9 of them deserved it. So, plus the coach, Auerbach, deserved it too. So it does not follow that the best player has to be on the best team. It just doesn't.
Well, the game on Sunday, Game 4, when Houston went up 3-1 in the series, well, to me was a perfect example. Harden did not play a particularly good game, did not shoot well. His teammates lifted him up and basically won that game. Then they had a big game. Some other players, Eric Gordon, several players came off the bench. They had 3 or 4 players off the bench that had double figures. You look at the box score for Oklahoma City. Whenever Westbrook would go out, they would have Oklahoma City had big leads throughout this series. Whenever Westbrook would go out, the lead would dissipate and they would just fall apart. And then he would have to kind of try to bring them back. And did he shoot as well in the fourth quarter when Houston is probably designing their defense more to stop him? No, he didn't. But to me, that doesn't take away from his greatness. He still put up another triple-double. He's put up, 3 straight triple-doubles in this playoff series, which is
he had one bad game, and I guess Harden had one bad game too. But they're both great players. They're probably the top 2 players in the league now. Durant, as far as his rating is concerned, yes, but he misses too many minutes with injuries. Harden and Westbrook are probably the best 2 players, and Milwaukee, I call him Topo because I can't pronounce his name, but he would be the 3rd in that group.
Really?
Yeah. Westbrook, Harden, and Topo. This year, it's Westbrook's. The last 2 years, it was really Harden, even though the so-called experts disagree almost every time. But the numbers show it pretty clearly that Westbrook was the best this year.
Well, to make your point regarding Kevin Durant, Golden State won the series 4-0 against Portland, just finished it out, yesterday or the day before. They played well without Kevin Durant. They played well with him. So not diminishing Kevin Durant's greatness, but of his value to that team, now that probably will be shown more as they get deeper in the playoffs. But when he went out of the lineup, they still performed at a high level. That would not be the case with Oklahoma City. If Russell Westbrook's out, they're losing.
Yeah, Golden State has 3 outstanding players, not counting Durant, and they won 1 title without him. And it wasn't just Curry, because Klay Thompson's an extraordinary player, and the playmaker is the power forward. I mean, they've got 3 outstanding players there, and now they've got 4, which means they're going to be awful tough to beat.
So what would be the top? Well, so what's the Tendex top 5 for the MVP this year?
It would be again. I haven't computed for taking away for Durant. The percentage basis, it's Westbrook, Durant, Topo, Harden, and Leonard. But Harden always plays the most minutes, and that
Right.
pushes him up because the more minutes you play, the less your substitute has to play.
Yeah.
So, all practicality, when the Tendex value rating is computed, it's going to be Westbrook first, and then either Topo or Harden second, and either James or James and Leonard will probably fill out the top five. Let's put it that way. Durant probably won't even make it because he missed so many games with injury.
I was going to ask you about LeBron James. Every year he's in the mix. What kind of compared to a couple years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, his rating is not quite as high, but he's still a dominant player, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you're in the top five in the league, and he has been for now about 13 years, I think, being in top five players in the league. I mean, most players, if they can extend their career to a peak value for 10 seasons, is terrific. James is a remarkable athlete. He's definitely one of the top 4 players of all time, and that's adding himself and Michael Jordan in with Robertson and Chamberlain. And those 4 guys have in common a lot of things: high skill, very good size and strength and leaping ability, great athleticism. I mean, it's pretty hard to beat when you don't have any weaknesses, because those guys also were good defensive players, and James is a good defensive player.
I mean, everybody's predicting, and I see no reason why to refute it. They're predicting another Golden State Cleveland final. I see nothing out there to indicate anything different. Do you?
No, that would be my choice too. That would be assuming that Durant comes back. That they'll struggle a bit. Portland was not really a playoff team. They were kind of I don't think they were as good as Miami, which didn't make the playoffs. To put it in a different context, had about the same record, but that was not a good challenge for Golden State. But they will be challenged if they miss Durant. Now, is Durant? I haven't seen his. When is he coming back?
He played in Game 4, so he.
Oh, he did. Okay, well,
he played in the last game, so I think he's back.
Well, then they're in good shape to go on because they have that extra player. No one else has 4 players like that, and even 3. When the Heat had James and Wade, they had Bosch, but really they had 2. Bosch was just kind of a third guy. He wasn't a James or a Wade, and that team was supposed to have 3, but really didn't. Golden State really does have 3 now, 4. So they're really hard to beat. The one thing they do not have very, very good is defense. Curry's a weak defensive player. They give up a lot of points, but they mostly outscore people. And if you can outscore people, it doesn't really matter how many points you give up.
Yeah, you're listening to the John Harris podcast on the airnetwork.net. I'm John Harris, joined by our special guest, Tendex originator, creator, guru, Dave Herrin, the original analytical basketball system. We've been talking a little NBA MVP. Dave projects that, according to Tendex, Russell Westbrook is the runaway MVP winner. We've talked about that. It's top 5 again, Dave. What's the top 5 MVP right now according to Tendex?
The next 2 after Westbrook would be Harden and Topo, and I'm not sure how that's going to work
from
out.
Milwaukee, like the Greek freak from Milwaukee.
Yeah, nobody can pronounce his name. And then the 2 after that, rounding out the top 5, would be LeBron James and Kawhi Leonard, with Durant not making it only because of his injury.
It's a lack of minutes. Tendex is a performance-based stat. It's a minutes-based. The longer the top players remain on the court, the more value they bring to the team. The fewer minutes they play, that means you have to bring in another player who's not as talented, whose rating is not as high. So that's why Tendex places extra value on the players that play the most minutes. Dave, let's make a quick switch here. We've been talking back and forth. We've been having some great discussions on the upcoming NBA draft, which will also be in June, along with the NBA, right after the NBA Finals, about a week after the NBA Finals. And you've got some interesting thoughts thoughts about this draft. Obviously, at the top, it's going to be a lot of freshmen selected. We won't deal with them today because we'll have time to talk about that. I want you to talk about some of the players who Tendex sees as being potentially really good NBA players who people aren't talking about.
Yeah, well, I just like to say one thing. First of all, sometimes the Tendex exposes guys who are really not good at all. Now that's not true in this draft. It's a deep draft, and there are probably going to be about 15 really, really good players in it, which is an unusual number. So those guys who are ranked near the top, the 2 point guards from the Pacific Coast, they're very good players. But the top-ranked players, according to Tendex, are senior Sindarius Thornwell of South Carolina, and they don't like him because he's a senior, blah, blah, blah. He should have come out if he was any good, blah, blah, blah. But he improved by 66% between his junior and senior years.
Wow!
In order to get a really high rating, even if he hadn't improved that much, his rating would be the highest stat of the bunch as far as his official Tendex value rating. He would be number one, and two other guys who would be right up there with him are the Collinses, Zach Collins of Gonzaga, who is a freshman, and John Collins of Wake Forest, who is a sophomore. Those are two big men, and they're very mobile, and they do everything very well. So those would actually be the top three, apparently, as I look at it now, according to Tendex. I haven't finished the stats. But they're not ranked any of the three in the top 10 by the scouts. So somebody out there is going to pick up some real jewels. And also we mentioned, or I mentioned, the Oregon player Jordan Bell.
Yes.
He also like Sindarius is a second rounder according to the scouts, at least the last I saw. Sometimes they change. But he's sort of like a lot like Dennis Rodman. Rodman was drafted in the second round, and he turned out to be a Hall of Fame player in spite of his unpleasing personality. He was a great, great player. And Jordan Bell is a lot like Rodman. He can just do anything on the defensive end of the floor. He's a consummate team player. He's always looking out for his team winning rather than his own stats. His rating is high. You know, his rating is definitely among the top 10, and I would put him in the top 5 simply because he's such a great defensive player, and you can't rate that all the time. You know, you can rate his block shots, but he's all over the floor on defense, which is the way Rodman was. And of course, Rodman was on 5 championship teams, and it would have been 6, but for a bad call by a referee. And that was with 2 separate teams, you know. So obviously Dennis Rodman was not a fluke because he was the dominant player of the Detroit team they won. Isaiah Thomas scored the points, but Dennis Rodman was the player. And then when he got with Chicago was fading. Jordan was getting along in years. But when Rodman joined the team in '96, they got refurbished fast.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he just brought that same defensive energy. Not that Jordan and Pippen didn't have it, but at that time they were slowing down a bit. But this Jordan Bell reminds me a lot of Dennis Rodman.
Wow. I said we weren't going to talk about the freshman, but I lied, Dave. Let's talk about one of the freshmen just briefly. How do you have Ball from UCLA? Where do you see? I know Tendex likes him. There's been talk that he could go number 1, probably 2. Where does Tendex have him in the draft?
Right up there. Like I said before, those guys are good. It's just that these other guys are better. He looks like a potential somewhere between 4 and 7, according to Tendex. Ball and Fultz and Josh Jackson.
Markelle Fultz.
So they're not overrated. It's just that the emphasis is too much on freshmen. So the senior is overlooked, the junior is overlooked, the sophomore is overlooked. That's the problem. They're overlooking these guys who are older.
You're listening to the John Harris podcast on the airnetwork.net. We're winding down here. We're speaking with Tendex creator and guru Dave Herrin. I can tell the listeners personally, I use the Tendex system. I covered the NBA for a long time, and I use it personally in my coverage. And one of the things I can tell you, let's look at a player. You see him in the playoffs right now. I'll tell you how Tendex works. He plays for Atlanta. He started off with Utah, Paul Millsap. Tendex had, I think, Paul Millsap as a top 5 player. I think when he came out, Paul Millsap was drafted by Utah in the second round. Tendex targeted him, identified him coming out of a small school in Louisiana as a lottery, not only not a lottery pick, a top 5 lottery pick. He has proven that value. So when he's talking to you about a Sindarius Thornwell from South Carolina and his rating, you really should listen to it and pay attention to it, because it's not based off of his opinion. It's based off of how many years now, Dave, of personal history, 3, 4, 5 decades.
Well, I was using it in long time. I was using it in '61 when I worked for the Knicks.
61. Okay, so we're talking about 5 decades.
At that time, though, they didn't have they weren't keeping track of blocks, steals, and turnovers then, so it was a little hard. But even then, you could just Robertson and Chamberlain just jumped off the charts. They just did, and that's the way it's always been. And don't forget Jordan Bell. They're projecting Bell also as a second rounder. Not only Thornwell, but Bell also is. He looks like to me a top 10, and if it were me, I would put him in the top 5. But
he'll never. We both know he nor Thornwell will get picked in the top 10. We can go out there and tell you that right now. That's not going to happen. Unfortunately, but we'll come back and look and see how Tendex had those players. But and I know, Dave, those 2 players are not going to get picked in the top 10. No. That's not going to happen. So it's unfortunate.
But the thing to do is to come back 5 years from now and say, well, who was right, the scouts or Tendex? And it's amazing how often Tendex is right. About 5 out of every 8 significant players, unless they have, sometimes Tendex and the scouts agree, but on the players that they disagree, the most important players, Tendex over the years has proven to be right on 5 out of 8. They pay the scouts an awful lot. But it's easy to prove this. It's easy for me to prove this. I mean, it's all down. The numbers prove it. I mean, it's just all there.
The last point I want to make, and we're going to wrap this up. You mentioned Thornwell's improvement, and that's another thing. Like a John Stockton, Michael Jordan. You told me when you rated those players in college, they showed tremendous improvement from year to year. And Thornwell showing that type of improvement indicates what a lot of the great players have done through the years. Yes,
you got to look for improvement. If a guy's not improving. If he's not improving, he's probably going to flatten out. Even if he has a great college career, if he's not improving, he's probably not going to have a great pro career. Look for the improvement. The Stocktons and the Jordans, they were above 10% a year improvement, and that's very good. I mean, every year they were going up 10% or more, and it continued when they got to the NBA. I think Stockton only hit his prime until his 4th NBA season, so he was improving about 7 seasons in a row, and Jordan, I think, hit his prime about his 2nd or 3rd NBA season. So improvement is really important.
Dave Herrin, the creator of the Tendex basketball rating system, the original basketball analytical guru, thank you so much for joining the John Harris podcast on the Air Network. We're going to get you back. We're going to probably talk some NBA Finals. We're definitely going to talk some more NBA Draft. Dave, thanks so much for your time. We'll be talking to you real soon.
Well, it's my pleasure, John. It's great being with you. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for joining us for another edition of the John Harris Podcast. Join us again next week for John Harris exclusively on the airnetwork.net.